I want to ask each of you a question just to kick us off. Do you think that with all the recent media attention and this extraordinary amount of debate, that the Catholic Church hierarchy has sort of got it, that it's understood what's at stake for it? Julie?
I see no evidence of it, and I think the public perception is one of a catastrophic failure of empathy and action and a failure to recognise the rule of law.
Francis?
Well, it depends which hierarchy and where. I don't think the Vatican gets it yet. I do think the senior archbishops in Australia do get it. They are saying that the days of the Church investigating itself are over. They are saying that transparency and accountability has arrived. But again, even inside bishops, some are still very defensive. Some are always wanting to make this sound like it's a political hunt on the Church rather than examining a massive, grave social issue.
And Eugene, in Ballarat, how would you answer that question?
Well, I would say that many individuals within the Church get it. I'd say the Ballarat community and to some extent the diocese get it. Whether or not that translates higher up the chain and whether the hierarchy, the curia or whatever parts of the lawmakers in the Vatican get it is another matter that remains to be seen. And I think we're talking there about the magnitude of the issue, which at a local level certainly is both understood and felt for.
Mm. And John, how would you see it as somebody who knows the inside of the Vatican?
Yeah, I mean, I think Francis put it very well by saying it depends who you're talking about. I think within the Vatican things are more complex, in part because the experience of different parts of the world has been different. But up to this point, it's been largely an Anglophone world phenomenon. I mean, that's what because the coverage
that's
has been
public,
becoming. Yeah,
well, yes, to it being
I mean the exposure and so on has been largely that. And I think that Rome is in a kind of slight difficulty because it has to try to work out a way of acknowledging all of this while recognising that actually these hierarchies are autonomous. They're not... I mean, it's not as if, these are branch offices of Rome. And so to some extent it leaves them to get on with their own business. Now, it can't do that any longer.
You realise that viewers watching this will say, what is he talking about?
Yeah.
They won't believe you.
Well, that may not be the case. I'm just saying the structure of the Roman Catholic Church is that these individual churches are actually autonomous institutions. Now, the role of Rome is in appointing bishops, for example. So I'm not saying it doesn't have a responsibility. What I'm trying to say is I think, in particular, Pope Francis is in a situation now that's going to be quite testing.
Let's look now at a brief summary of recent events.
In his 4 days of testimony before Australia's Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, Cardinal George Pell has been forced out of the Vatican and into the global media spotlight.
This hearing has brought the issue of child sex abuse to the door of the Vatican.
Pope Francis, please help us.
Got the full backing of the Pope.
Many Catholics now wonder whether they can support a church structure that's systematically colluded in covering up ongoing child sexual abuse by clergy.
There's been far too much silence. I mean, there's been far too much not addressing of the issues.
But the question has to be asked, is the Vatican getting the message?
I wonder, Francis, whether you believe that in an odd way, having Pell so front and centre with his candour about his power play, whether it in fact was it shone a light on attitudes within the higher structures of the Church.
Well, certainly as far as the Royal Commission goes, we hadn't seen it go all the way to the door of the Vatican. It's really disturbing that in the same week as we have Cardinal Pell's evidence, we have a even more senior head of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, Cardinal Müller, making public statements that take us back decades, saying this is really about bad eggs, a few bad priests. It's not about the culture of the Church. And yet that's when people go, you don't get it. The real scandal has been about how church leadership systematically covered up, systematically lied, systematically deceived not only the world, not only local Catholic communities, but even priests themselves.
Can I just say, I find this a heartbreaking situation because, I think the Catholic Church needs to have a reformation. It needs a complete Reformation. I think those Catholics who still yearn for faith in their life are beginning to take a more Protestant view. They're going straight to the Bible. They're going straight to fellow Catholics, often gathering outside of churches to talk about faith, because the authority of the church is gone. The pews are emptying. I personally find that a tragedy.
Why?
Well, because, I mean, I'm a Protestant, not a Catholic, but I am a parish person. I'm not a senior person like the people I'm with tonight. And I know the great power and joy of parish life, of cross-generational relationships, of working together to do good things in the community, of reading the New and Old Testament and finding ever-developing meaning that brings succour and purpose and moral power in one's life. When I say power,
so it's a consolation at a deep level.
And a guidance, a moral guidance. But I certainly know many Catholics who aren't going to churches. They're not going to Mass for that. And even more importantly, children who are ever more difficult to encourage to take an interest in the value of faith look to what's happening, not just in the Catholic Church, although unfortunately that's borne the greater magnitude, but they're looking in other faith groups as well, and they are repelled, rightly repelled by what they see.
I mean, how do you see this, Eugene? You've been right at the epicentre of it.
I would say that, interestingly, John mentioned before the word inertia. And I think that the perception of inertia at the higher levels of the hierarchy, certainly within the Catholic Church, is one of the big problems. But what we have in Ballarat is a grassroots level of support and reformation. But what we've also seen at a diocesan level, but certainly the schools have been extraordinary, is the first steps towards that healing, which involve both support for the victims and looking at ways forward. Now, the Loud Fence movement, which is a symbolic demonstration of support for victims involving tying ribbons to fences. Now, that was a grassroots idea that has just grown. It is now a symbol around the town of the support of those victims. It's been enormously encouraging to them. We've seen a number of parish priests embrace it. We've seen the Bishop Paul Bird tie ribbons to the cathedral. Right. And, of course, just before the evidence was given last week, Cardinal Pell himself tied a ribbon within the Vatican. But the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, to a certain extent, is still seems to be afflicted by that inertia in regard to leadership.
Let me just ask John about that. Do you agree?
I think one thing that's sort of complicating in this is to do with the different theologies. You've talked about Protestantism, in which people can go direct to Scripture. But within the Catholic tradition, not only the Roman Catholic tradition broadly, High Anglicanism, and within the Orthodox Church, the priest has a particular role because as a mediator of sacrament. And so the liturgical practice of Catholics has at its heart, very often, a priest facilitating the sacrament. So I think things are changing, but there's still going to be this issue within the Catholic Church of the centrality of the priest. And insofar as that role has been besmirched or shadowed by this, that really is a problem.
But see, Geraldine, I don't see the issue being the centrality of the priest. I see it as to whether the Church accepts civil law. The Reformation involved legal history where we split off the ecclesiastical courts and the King's courts, the Queen's courts. And it's not clear to me now that if there's an allegation that a priest is abusing a child, that the senior person who hears it will ring the police. And that's what I mean by reformation. They need to recognise the civil law. They are not a law unto themselves.
But that seems to be a general... I mean, I'm not disputing that in the slightest, but what I'm saying is within the context of the Catholic Church, there isn't really an option of carrying forward that doesn't have the role of the priest central to it.
The new model of leadership in the secular world is much more servant leadership.
What about Vatican II? Didn't they turn the altars around and say hi?
Eugene?
I was just going to say, the interesting thing about leadership here is whether it is actually a listening leadership. And that's probably one of the key issues that came out of the evidence that Cardinal Pell gave last week, which gave one impression, and the impression, I imagine, generally speaking, certainly of the survivors, was of an intractability, of an unlistening style of leadership. By contrast, the meeting with the survivors, which by all accounts was very genuine, the Cardinal came out of that making promises in relation to a healing centre here in Ballarat. And now, they're ideas that were actually initiated by some of the survivors. So in that instance, we have a contrast to that intractable, unlistening hierarchy with a leadership, in Cardinal Pell's case, saying, here is an idea we can perhaps work towards.
I'm just going to put that to you, Francis. You're there listening right within the church.
Yes, well, look, a couple of points. The sex abuse scandal has really confronted the way the church has played out power. It's how it's played out participation, who gets to make decisions, where are they made, and how are the secrets kept. That's what's been going on. And the church itself has been threatened by the victims of sex abuse. But the important point, picking up your point, is that civil law has precedence over canon law, particularly in this area. For example, in Australia, although the states have different laws, where an individual has information about a person being abused as a child, that must immediately go to the police.
Now, that is part of reporting.
That is part of the church's protocols in Australia.
I personally, from all the I've been watching at the Royal Commission, have no confidence that the leadership of the Catholic Church think, if I'm aware of a serious allegation, you ring 000. I don't have any confidence they're planning to ring the police.
Well, I understand that, but I do understand that.
Well, is there any evidence?
Yes, there's quite a lot of evidence now that a person who approaches any of the Catholic Church agencies or head office, they are encouraged and even assisted to go to the police. Remember, if you're an adult, you've got a common law right to go or not go to the police. But if you're a child, everyone is obliged immediately to send the information to the police. And this is the problem. The law in Australia is not clear. But your point is the really important one. There is a moral obligation and responsibility to go to the police.
I can't speak to the details of Australia, and perhaps we don't fully know what those would be, but I think this is a message that is getting through. Part of the reason it's getting through is because, not to shift slightly to the United States, because of the highly litigious character of the United States, I think people are very alert to their vulnerability to certain kinds of civil and criminal actions.
But what a lot of people want to know, and of course this is one of the jobs of the Royal Commission itself, is what are the cultural reasons, certainly within the church, but other organisations, which led to that moral failure, and what is it doing about it now?
Can I say something very brief? I mean, it's a very large issue. I think those cultural conditions differ from one country to another. I think obviously there's the culture of the church, but there's also the culture of the populations that the church has served. But the point about this that I think is interesting is the question, priests just don't come from out of the sky, right, or from a secret island. They're themselves growing up before they ever get anywhere near being a priest. They're growing up in a wider culture.
What about recruitment, for instance? It would seem to be a major failing on the part of its recruitment process
its
that
candidates.
It didn't weed out. And it would seem to be what is being done now in the Christian Brothers or any order or the Catholic Church in general to establish that the children of the future will
Can I just say one thing?
Hang on, Julie.
I just want to say something, because we've got a newspaper man here, and it strikes me the countries in which we know what's been going on are the countries which have a free press. And the countries which don't have a free press, we don't know what's going on. And when I see the Pope get off a plane and he's got 1 million people in Africa, I shudder. I shudder, because I know they're in nations that are less democratic. They don't have a free press. We've had to face our horror because we've got films like Spotlight. It's now made into popular culture. You know, that's my concern. All this emphasis on we are a growing faith, often where you're growing is where you don't have democracy and freedom of press.
Well, I think the point is that the Royal Commission, to this point, is looking at 20, 30 years ago, and we're looking at the conditions and culture of the Catholic Church then. We're looking at the selection processes and style then.
It's backward-looking to that extent,
and that's the problem. By the beginning of next year, the Royal Commission will now swing to the why question. How come it happened in the Catholic Church? Sure, it's happened in other places, but what is particular about the Catholic Church? And picking up the point earlier, clericalism, the abuse of power...
The role of the priest, the central role of the priest.
Absolutely, is at the heart of the problem. Of course, the type of people that were selected is a problem. Of course, the way people have been supervised is a problem.
But it's also a disrespect for children. What makes me weep as you hear these elderly men being interviewed again and again is the ease with which they've put their regard for the church before the safety of children. And even in that recent evidence because Jesus was all about children and care of children. Didn't he say, if you want to
Suffer
look to
the little
God...
children to come unto me.
But even more than that, if you want to see God, look to children. And yet, when Mr Cardinal Pell said, the child came to me, but he didn't want me to do anything, he didn't ask me to do anything, and then he said, I'd do it differently today, but I thought, would you ring the police, Cardinal? Would you ring the police, or would you still protect the church?
See, I think Francis is exactly right when he talked about clericalism. That's why I said we can talk about there's two senses of the culture of the Catholic Church. One is where the clerical culture, the church of the church structures, and then there is this broader sense of Catholic consciousness, which includes the laity. And the laity, I think, have been complicit as well in clericalism. They have too often deferred to the priest as a certain, not just a spiritual authority, but as it were quite extensively an authority and so on. And that's been a big problem that has to be addressed. But then to link that to something that Eugene raised, it seems to me extremely important.
I've got to come in on that. That is classic victim blaming.
No.
If you want your child baptised, if you want your child confirmed, if you want to be married, if you want your mother buried, you're subject to that man.
Yeah, but you needn't. That's the point. I mean, the people have deferred too extensively to the priest. There are some matters in which the priest is a relevant authority, sacramentally and so on, but there are other matters in which, a more robust response to the priest would tell them to get stuff. Now, the Catholic Church has this problem that, of course, it's finding it difficult to recruit people. I mean, the declining number
because
of vocations.
Because of celibacy.
Well, for whatever reasons, I think secularisation in the wider world, there are a whole series of factors. Whatever the causes of this are, here's the problem, here's what the particular danger. Simultaneously, it has all of these difficulties, and then it's also still trying to find priests, and it has to be very, very careful not to sacrifice the standards of scrutiny and so on that you're concerned with, quite rightly, in the effort to get priests. And I think the Church is just going to have to live with the fact there are going to be fewer priests. It has to restructure things, reorganise things in a way in which the laity have a much greater role and so on. But I think that laity have to become more responsible, more questioning, and clericalism is not going to be purged by just leaving it to the priests.
Well, I think that's the point, Geraldine. It's time for the Catholics, adults, to come out.
Exactly.
I mean, we have to start becoming an adult church, because part of the clericalism is that we, lay people, allow priests and bishops to lord it over us, and we don't stand up. Ordinary Catholics are saying, we want to respond with the heart of what it is to be a Catholic, not with the defensiveness of an institution, but as a community of people, as seekers who are trying, like you say, at a very basic level of life, at the parish level, to be together seeking the good.
Can anything be done to improve matters from here on in, now that we've got to this dramatic juncture? Julie?
I think in many organisations, when the leadership profoundly let people down, they often go to their own little unit within the organisation and say, this little team are okay. So my impression from Catholic friends is there are still people with very close relationships with individual priests and very active participation in the refugee movement, in concern about the homeless, care for the, all those core New Testament values are in action. So one response will be to go very, very local. But what I want is the Reformation. I want a democracy, a democratic management system.
Julie, you'll wait forever for that.
No, it'll come, because you'll have your schools and you'll cling to them, but if you can't stop them touching the kids, they'll leave the schools as well. The pews are going to be empty in 20 years max. The crisis is hit. The Reformation didn't come gently, it came violently, and I think it's coming.
Eugene?
Well, there is the possibility that the repair could come gently. I talked about small steps before. Here in Ballarat last year, a group of parishioners organised their own liturgy, but they did it with the approval of the bishop. It was called a liturgy for lament and hope, I think. And they did that knowing that it was a very sensitive subject, knowing that a lot of the survivors would not go anywhere near a church.
Did you say the bishop presided over this?
The bishop certainly approved it, and we got a letter from the cardinal saying how much he approved it. And
Cardinal Pell.
And, that's right. And I do believe, the survivors themselves aren't after a revolution. I think they would like to see a couple of things, one of which they've expressed again and again, and that is the protection of children in future. And I think that's very important. Obviously, the Catholic education system is flourishing here in Ballarat, certainly. And I would say the reassurances that what has happened in the past can't happen again are there. But I'm sure the Catholic Education Office is working to make sure that's locked in stone.
Francis, your thoughts? It's Moira Rayner, who's a Melbourne writer and lawyer, has said, bring in the ultimate outsiders. If you want to really reform structures, bring in women. Which has that got any agency at all in the church at the moment?
Well, I would hope so. Being the father of daughters, I would really hope so. And I agree with people who say that if women were part of the decision-making and oversight roles in the past, I do think there would have been less occurrence of child sex abuse. The other point is this: whether it's reform, whether it's renewal, whether it's regeneration, it's actions rather than words that matter at the moment. And that's when I speak with victims, they say they want two things. They want to be believed and they want to belong.
They want to belong.
That doesn't mean they want to belong to the church. No, it doesn't mean they want to belong to the church. But they want to feel they belong in their community, that they're not odd, they're not put outside, they're not abandoned, they're not somehow a problem. We are still needing to work out ways to make victims feel that they are integrated back into normal life, let alone whether they can be comfortable in a church setting.
You're saying this is beyond church in a way?
Of course. You go to the Royal Commission hearings and, of course, everyone focuses in on victims, rightly at one level, at another level. These poor people have to then try and integrate back into their normal lives, and you hear them say the process is re-traumatising. So we as a community might be getting a lot of knowledge and insight, but at what cost at the same time?
John Haldane, will Pope Francis take the bull by the horns in some form?
Well, it's a very good question. You see, I agree with everything that's been said, but I think insofar as we're talking about the Catholic Church and not just individual communities and so on, but some larger entity, I think that one thing that the survivors and family and so on will now be very interested in is to see what is the uptake at the heart of Rome. There, I suspect there may be some disappointment. I'm sure one of the most interesting conversations that I would like to be privy to is the conversation between Pell and Pope Francis in the wake of these matters. I think in particular, of course, also people are possibly looking for the head of Pell. Insofar as that last matter is concerned, I don't expect that Pope Francis will lose Pell. So I'm afraid it's the old story about Rome. It takes a long time. And that's very unattractive. But you're asking me a question about what I think is going to happen, not what I ought to happen. I'm not telling what I think is going to happen.
I would hope that if he is having those quiet conversations with the Holy Father, that he uses some of his push-through to get things done. Because the more the Pope waits, the more the Pope takes time, the more people say, here we go, it's the same old, same old.
We have to go, I'm afraid. Thank you very much indeed to my guests, Francis Sullivan, Julia McCrossan, John Haldane and Eugene Duffy. Thank you very much indeed.